Thanks, John. So, yeah, today I'll be talking about, this is a topic of my master's thesis, and interested in the topic of incentivising development of what I call unmonopolisable therapies using flexible price mechanisms. So, next slide. So this is something that's a hidden and deadly problem. The issue is there's thousands of potential cures for various diseases, but there are no incentives for development under the current patent system. And nobody finds out about these cures or treatments because they never progress beyond the preclinical stage. There's three categories of these therapies that we've categorized. So it's unpatentable therapies, unmonopolizable therapies, and unprofitable therapies. And I'll be mainly focusing on the middle one. But these categories don't fit within the current business model of the pharmaceutical industry, which relies on finding new patentable molecules and enforcing a monopoly price for at least 10, 15 years. Any evidence of screening these therapies is anecdotal because of the high level of secrecy in the pharmaceutical industry. So the problem is that the public doesn't really find out about it, and because there's not any data collected on it. So yeah, my background is I'm the founder and a trustee of a medical prize charitable trust. And that was basically one of the missions is to implement one of the proposals in my thesis, which was a crowd-funded prize for clinical trials of unmonopolizable therapies. And it's a bit of a mouthful, obviously, so I'm just going to be discussing, in this presentation, discussing what unmonopolizable therapies are and why there's a problem, and how a flexible prize might help solve that particular problem. So what are unmonopolizable therapies? Well, mainly they're second uses of off-patent drugs. So basically once a drug goes off-patent, it becomes generic and its price falls to essentially a marginal cost, so sort of cents rather than just the cost of manufacture, essentially. Until that time, though, drugs tend to be at the monopoly price, which is a significant markup. You know, it could be 10,000% or more. Drug companies use those profits to essentially pay for the cost of turning those, of doing clinical trials to prove that they work. And it's been estimated that's around $1 billion per new drug. So that's the justification for the monopoly prices. But the problem is that once drugs go off patent, no one's really incentivized to find new uses for those drugs. Similarly, supplements and diets and lifestyle interventions, there's not any interest in finding, at least from the private industry, in finding ways to exploit those particular therapies and find that they're safe and effective, because you can't really enforce a monopoly price over the ingredients. And so, and then doctors are free to prescribe off-label drugs, or generic cheap drugs off-label, so for new therapies. And if patients can access the ingredients themselves cheaply, perform the treatment themselves, then again, there's limited incentives to conduct clinical trials. So the next screen. So, and this is the main problem of unmonopolizable therapies, is that the pharmaceutical companies can't build a business model around it if it requires them to sue doctors and patients in order to enforce a monopoly. It's too expensive, and detecting infringement is too difficult. So if you have a patent over using some drug that they can buy at a supermarket or or get prescribed from their doctor for a different indication, there's no way you can sort of detect that versus the manufacturer of a completely new drug. You can definitely stop them manufacturing that drug. So as a result, researchers in that area have to rely on scarce public funding, which grant funding, which has about 10% or less chance of being approved, and generally doesn't support clinical trials in humans. So there's quite a few unmonopolizable therapies. So some examples are semi-vegetarian diet for treatment of Crohn's disease, probiotics for treatment of Crohn's disease, IV vitamin C for treating cancer, off-patent DCA that's got quite a bit of media attention for treatment of cancer, and people were kind of importing the ingredients themselves and treating themselves. The vitamin E for treatment of Alzheimer's disease, that was recently conducted a clinical trial, and it was one of the first treatments to actually show a reduction in onset of the disease by 6 months, and no other drug has shown that. Off-patent tuberculosis vaccine for treating type 1 diabetes, again another potentially groundbreaking research, but unfortunately, because the vaccine is off patent, no pharmaceutical companies are interested. Dietary restriction for treatment of type 2 diabetes, that's had quite a bit of research around it, but it's just an example of something you can't really build a business model around. Off-patent ibuprofen for treatment of Parkinson's disease, off-patent anti-inflammatory, an old sort of 1950s drug for treatment of drug-resistant tuberculosis, and then things like lifestyle interventions like exercise and meditation, treatment of depression. So just focusing on IV vitamin C, that's actually something that they're doing in Christchurch in the Otago School of Medicine. They're looking at the, it's probably the only centre undertaking this research, and what they've found is what they're trying to study is that there's a relationship between low levels of vitamin C and upregulation of HIF1, which is a gene that drives tumour growth. There's been some case studies, so that's individual studies showing that IV vitamin C can induce cancer remission, although there was a large clinical trial showing that oral supplementation can do the same thing. Otago is the only centre undertaking this research, and the problem is that doctors don't really know what to do if their patients want to try this, and there's no randomised clinical controlled trials that have been published. Margaret has to basically, she gets them, she can't get support from the government, traditional government sources, just because it's not really, again, because of the competitiveness and it's generally quite conservative. So it's appealed to the public to raise $1 million. She's got enough money to get started, but again, this is an example of this kind of problem, that there's no interest from private pharmaceutical companies. So another example of unmonopolisable therapy is semi-vegetarian diet for treatment of Crohn's disease. So there's currently a rising incidence of Crohn's disease. It's an autoimmune disorder that attacks the gut, and it's currently incurable, requires a lifetime immunosuppressive medication, often really expensive, costs around $20,000 a year per person. It's $1 billion a year globally. It's one of the top-selling or most profitable drugs in the world is Humira, and Remicade is probably about number 6. So it costs governments, health insurers, billions and billions of dollars. But there's other ways of unfortunately different unmonopolisable therapies, but there's not really any money or any private incentive to fund larger clinical trials. For instance, Japanese studies showed a 92% remission after 2 years for a semi-vegetarian diet. Frontline treatments could only do 62% remission. and there's lots of other types of unmonopolizable therapies for Crohn's disease, such as antibiotics, fish oil, fecal transplantation. So the current system, the only options for funding unmonopolizable therapies is through government charitable grants. You could also try direct fundraising to the public, e.g. through crowdfunding. What often happens is people just get online and Google themselves and self-experiment, which is obviously not optimal and full of anecdotal reports and selection, confirmation bias, things like that. And then there's alternative treatment clinics, woo medicine, which has, well, it's again, it's not optimal, and some of them can be kind of a bit snake oily, so not any real clinical research. So the proposed solution that that I was looking at was, how can we get these unmonopolizable therapies so our doctors will be comfortable considering them, is we need a new incentive to fund clinical trials for these therapies. And what we're proposing for this particular project is crowdfunding cures as a crowdfunded prize for clinical trials. Essentially, you would receive a percentage of a prize fund for publishing the non-monopolizable therapy where you could show that it was safe and effective. Initial goals to raise a prize fund for Crohn's disease and then expand to other disease areas. One of the benefits of prizes is that versus the grants is that there's no need to pick the winners in advance, so you've got a limited administration cost. The prize just sits there, and essentially the market creates the drive to find who would fulfill the criteria for winning the prize, and that's essentially publishing a clinical trial that showed this treatment was actually worked and was safe and effective. You can also show donors, you can say that your money is guaranteed to fund successful clinical trials versus traditional charities where you might not be able to, you're not sure where the money's going or might get wasted essentially. And then also the benefit of prize is that you don't pay out for data or clinical trials that don't work. And then essentially that's also very valuable to society to show which therapies don't actually work. In some ways, in some circumstances, even more valuable than particularly if it's very popular. So the next slide. So just more about us. We're crowdfunded cures as an initiative of the Medical Prize Charitable Trust, New Zealand charity, and the current trust board comprised of myself and Enrico, my brother, who's an engineer and works with software, also in software and IT. We've partnered with Professor Michael Schultz of the Gut Health Network, which is a group of IBD researchers at Otago, and we've also partnered with the Health Impact Fund, and which are proposing a similar flexible prize mechanism to help as another alternative incentive for pharmaceutical research, but mainly focused on neglected diseases, so AIDS, and malaria. So how it works is that the donors would pledge amounts towards the prize fund, and that would essentially say create a pool. You could also hopefully be able to get governments and health insurers on board as well, to the extent it would help reduce their costs. And researchers would apply to register to the prize fund. and the clinical trials, they would basically propose a treatment protocol. The clinical researchers, the researchers would have to raise the money themselves, so, but they would be able to use the prize as leverage, so it would create a market incentive where there wasn't any market incentive before. That's, I think, one of the more difficult aspects of this, the prize fund is forcing, I guess, researchers to go out and find money from investors, but they already have to spend a lot of money and time doing trying to fulfill grants, so it's not really much of a big ask, I don't think. And anyway, what happens is that once they've raised the money, they can get an independent contract research organisation to execute the treatment protocol. And if they can show that the clinical trial has been effective, then they're registered the prize fund for 5 years. And what happens is that once you're registered, you get a percentage of the prize fund paid out every year, and the proportion of the prize fund you get, the fixed proportion, is a fixed amount, but you get a proportion relative to your the health impact of your particular clinical trial. And you can measure that, say, by a standard clinical measurement. So for Crohn's disease, it's the Crohn's disease activity index. And you can measure the drop from baseline to after treatment. And so it's a fair means of comparing between other clinical trials, and which are also compared against baseline. New slide. So this is just a bit of a graphic about how it works. So there's donors would pledge prize funds towards a prize. Applicants would submit a compound or a particular unmonopolizable treatment, so an off-patent drug or proposing a diet or a supplement or a lifestyle intervention, and they would raise funds to conduct these clinical trials independently by the contract research organisation. There's publication, and then there would be an audit by the expert panel. And then they would be, if those clinical trials are successful, they'll be allocated and a percentage of the annual fixed amount payable for 5 years. So it's $2 million every year. So say if it's 50-50, if there's another clinical trial that's registered and they're both exactly the same and they both are effective, but they both reduce or they increase the chance of remission by the same amount, then they would receive $1 million each. So next slide. This is like a stakeholder chart. So the source of the prize fund hopefully would be public donors, charities, non-government organisations, government health departments like Pharmac that really pay for these monopolisable drugs, health insurers in the same way they're incentivised to help reduce healthcare costs, and hospitals and treatment centres. The participants would be academic researchers, principally those kind of, it could also be biotech companies, but it's probably more on the academic side, and these kinds of researchers that can't traditionally get will have to compete for scarce public funding. And then there's the contract research organisation, which conducts the clinical trials independently, and then there's the prize administration expert panel, which provides the oversight. So a bit similar to the XPRIZE model. So that's it, I guess. Just I'd be happy to, I hope this makes sense. I'll be really interested in getting some feedback about what you guys, if it made sense, or any thoughts around if you've heard about this problem, or whether you think this is a problem, or how it might work, and anything you might want to ask, because spend a lot of time on it, so I'm sure I can answer your questions.